Okay, so the only thing you guys need to worry about having done for next time is reading the Gloria and Zaldua piece, the How to Tame a Wild Tone. One thing that I will warn you all about is that there is a lot of untranslated Spanish in the piece. And like this is all kind of part of the author's design. She wants there to be untranslated Spanish because that's really part of the structure of her argument. So, you know, like just go to Google Translate or whatever, and you know, when there's Spanish words you don't know or a Spanish phrase you don't know, just type it in, it'll tell you what it means. But yeah, you'll want to keep that handy while you're reading. Before we get started, does anybody have any questions about anything at all related to the class?
It's not really a question, but I use this to help me get through Spanish. It's called Spanish Dictionary, but like Spanish Dictionary, that sounds so wrong. But you type in the words in like Spanish and it'll translate to English or vice versa. So.
Yeah, Google Translate works the same way. Yeah, it's
way worse, but this one's like actually accurate.
Yeah, good. Yeah, and I think all I want is just for you guys to be able to get the gist of what the Spanish means. But yeah, the Spanish language stuff is untranslated at the author's request because, like I said, like a lot of her argument is about hybridity in language and being able to switch back and forth between different languages and different levels of language. So that's why that's there. But it is kind of important that you keep track of that. Any other questions or comments about anything before we continue?
I can't think of anything.
Okay. All right, then let's talk about Frederick Douglass. So how many of you are already familiar on some level with Frederick Douglass? What do you guys know about Frederick Douglass already?
He was an abolitionist.
Okay, yeah, abolitionist. What else do you know about him, if anything?
He was originally enslaved.
Yes, he was enslaved and escaped to freedom, right? So yeah, he's an escaped slave. Anything else?
Didn't he work on the Underground Railroad?
Um,
He helped with it?
You know, that I'm not really sure about. Most of his abolitionist activity was actually based in communication in some way, right? So he was a newspaper editor. That was really kind of the big deal, right? He was a newspaper editor and author. And he was also an in-demand lecturer, right? Because he was an extremely skilled orator, and people would come to hear him speak. So, for Douglass, the very idea of literacy is caught up with the idea of freedom, right? Right? The printed word in particular is caught up in his notion of what it means to be free. Now let's think back to last time when we talked about Seneca and Seneca's notion of what liberal studies were, right? So what did liberal studies literally mean for Seneca?
I don't have my favorite. It was freedom, wasn't it?
Yeah, liberal studies, were those fields of study that were open to and important for a free person, right? But the only freedom that Seneca was particularly interested in was freedom from worldly concerns, right? Freedom from the need or desire to make money, freedom from emotional upset, right? Freedom from anything that would disturb sort of his personal equanimity. So we're dealing in Seneca with rather a different idea of freedom than what Douglas is talking about, right? Douglas is talking about a much more literal notion of freedom here. And how is this associated for him in this portion of his autobiography with the printed word and with literacy? Why is literacy so closely bound together with freedom?
It's essentially what Waveman is.
How so?
Well, in his pursuit to read, he interacted with people,
Mm-hmm.
and that kind of gave him a sense of freedom from the cruelties he experienced, because he experienced kindness. He also learned that if you don't know where to go because you can't read the signs kind of thing, then you can't go that way, sort of deal.
Okay.
Kind of like, I guess, Alice in Wonderland, looking at all the different signs and not knowing which way to go.
Uh-huh.
If you can't, he said once he figured out how to write, he would try to escape.
Yeah, well, and there is actually a very specific practical reason he needs to learn how to write in order to escape, right? What is he? Yeah, he wants to be able to forge a pass, right? So he actually has an incredibly practical reason.
I'm gonna think of it as like the slave owners had control over the slaves, and so for them being like illiterate was also a way for them to control the slaves and keep them in order, because
Uh-huh.
I feel like if they were literate, then they could try to start movements and then overthrow their owners.
Yeah, what is his mistress always trying to take away from him?
Newspaper.
Yeah, it's not books she's worried about so much. She's always trying to take newspapers out of his hands, right? He's always trying to get his hands on newspapers. Yeah, you know, they don't want him reading books either, right? They don't want him reading at all. And we will see that he does get quite a lot actually from a particular book. But mostly what he's after is newspapers. And the thing that they're trying to keep him away from is newspapers. Because newspapers will keep him informed about current events, right? Newspapers will give him some information about his relative place in the world and things that are going on outside of the houses of the slave owners, right? So yeah, what is being kept from him is information about current events and politics. And remember, too, that this is actually the line of work that he goes into once he does forge his pass and make his way to freedom. He prints a newspaper and becomes a journalist. So let's look at the beginning. Well, let's actually, one more question before we get started, right? So what have most of the thinkers that we've looked at argued you need in order to learn?
Determination.
Maybe on some level, right? But what does Sun Tzu, for example, argue you have to have?
Our teacher.
You have to have a teacher, right? Yes. So most of the other thinkers we've been looking at are thinking about things you will learn from a teacher or from a guide, right? What does Douglas lack? He has no one to teach him, right?
Well, didn't you say his like mistress was trying to teach him, and then her husband made her stop?
Yeah. So he has the beginnings of a rudimentary education, right? That are then cut short. And the rest of what he cobbles together, he has to do on his own, right? So let's look at the beginning of this. Can I get somebody to read the first paragraph on page 23? Starting, they lived in Master Hugh's family about 7 years.
I lived in Master Hugh's family about 7 years. During this time, I succeeded in learning to read and write. In accomplishing this, I was compelled to resort to various stratagems. I had no regular teacher. My mistress, who had kindly commenced to instruct me, having compliance with the advice and direction of her husband, not only ceased to instruct, but had set forth her face against my being instructed by anyone else. It is due, however, to my mistress to say of her that she did not adopt this course of treatment immediately. She at first lacked the depravity indispensable to shutting me up in mental darkness. It was at least necessary for her to have some training in the exercise of irresponsible power to make her equal to the task of treating me as though I were a brute.
Okay, you can stop there. Thank you. So I want to think for a minute about this particular phrase he uses. He accuses his mistress of shutting him up in mental darkness, right? What does this sound like? Like what does it sound like is happening here? In terms of being shut up in the dark. What does it sound like she's doing to him by doing this?
You want a psychological viewpoint or physical, emotional, kind of?
Think metaphorical.
I'm not good at that.
Think about an action associated with this, right? Like, so if you are shutting someone up in the dark, right?
It's kind of like
Off from everything.
Mm-hmm.
It's like making him feel smaller than what he actually is, and like make him feel like, okay, maybe I can't do
Mhm.
this.
Well, in what kinds of places do we shut people up in the dark?
Cupboards, basements, jail cells. There we go.
Yes.
Uh-huh.
Yes, he's talking here about imprisonment, right? Right? That ignorance is a kind of prison. That her refusal to teach him lands him in, right? And when she refers to him as a brute, does everybody understand what that means, what a brute is in this context? He's using the word a way that we tend not to use it anymore.
I guess uneducated or as far as like mannerisms and stuff, not necessarily mental education, but just their overall mannerisms and behaviors.
Okay. So you're thinking about, yeah, like the way we usually use the term is applied to a person, right? So a brute is, someone who's just sort of big and dumb, right? Now, in Douglas's day, this term was not usually applied to people. A brute is a beast. Right? A brute is an animal. A creature that is not endowed with reason.
So kind of like what we did like in the Gulliver's Travels piece, with him comparing himself to the what were they called?
To the Apules, right? Yeah, those creatures that are kind of like debased human beings, right? Yeah, he thinks of them as brutes, right? As animals, not as reasonable creatures like himself, right? And yeah, I think that Douglas is suggesting a similar thing. That his mistress is treating him like an animal, not like a fellow human being, right?
It's a shame, she was so kind.
Well, and I think that this is actually a place where if we look at the next paragraph, right, this is a place where we can start making connections with the Confucian thinkers in particular. Right? Can I get somebody to read from, "My mistress was, as I have said, a kind and tender-hearted woman." Somebody who hasn't read yet. Go ahead.
That is why I did not look up the first time.
All you gotta do is read words. It's not
I
scary.
know, but like every time. You want me to like all of it or?
Yeah, I'll tell you when to stop.
Okay. My mistress was, as I have said, a kind and tender-hearted woman, and in the simplicity of her soul, she commenced, when I first went to live with her, to treat me as she supposed one human being ought to treat another. In entering upon the duties of a slaveholder, she did not seem to perceive that I sustained to her the relation of mere chattel.
Do you guys know what chattel means, what that word means?
Personal possession.
Yeah, it's
I think I looked it up.
yeah, it's usually an animal that you possess, right? So like livestock. Okay, you can keep going.
That I was saying to her that the relation of a mere chattel, and that for her to treat me as a human being was not only wrong, but dangerously so. Slavery proved as injurious to her as it did to me. When I went there, she was a pious, okay, warm and tender-hearted woman. There was no sorrow or suffering for which she had not a tear. She had bread for the hungry, clothes for the naked, and a comfort for every mourner that came within her reach. Slavery soon proved its ability to divest her of these heavenly qualities. Under its influence, the tender heart became stone, and the lamb-like disposition gave way to one of a tiger-like fierceness. The first step in her downward course was in her ceasing to instruct me. She now commenced to practice her husband's precept. She finally became more violent in her opposition than her husband himself. She was not satisfied with simply doing as well as he had commended. She seemed anxious to do better. Nothing seemed to make her more angry than to see me with a newspaper. She seemed to think that here lay the danger. I have had her rush at me with a face made up of all fury, and snatch the newspaper from me, in a manner that was fully revealed of her apprehension. She was an apt woman, and a little experience soon demonstrated to her satisfaction that education and slavery were incompatible with each other.
Okay, thank you. So, what's the mistress's nature like at first?
Nice. Compassionate.
Yeah, kind, compassionate, sensitive, generous, right? And then what happens to her over time?
Cool. Kind of.
Yeah, that kindness dries up and she becomes cruel. And what is he arguing made her become cruel?
Slavery.
Yeah, the entering upon the duties of a slaveholder, right? So what he is trying to suggest here is that slavery damages not just the slave, but also the nature of the slave owner, right? That people who are of a kind and gentle nature, once they are put in the role of slave owner, it encourages them to become cruel and brutal, right?
Power corrupts.
Pardon?
The theory, the idea of power corrupting.
Yeah. I think that we can actually sort of like take this in a more specific direction as well, and think about say how Sun Tzu and Mencius would read this. Now, what is the one thing that Sun Tzu and Mencius do agree on?
Respect.
Maintaining your goodness by practicing.
Yeah, in order to maintain your goodness, you have to practice it, right? And what sorts of things can make you go bad?
Your environment.
Yeah, your environment can make you go bad, right? So for Mencius, who believes we're naturally good, and this seems to accord maybe a little bit more closely with Mencius than with Sun Tzu, right? Because he seems to believe his mistress was good at first.
And they also agree that through education, like humans can improve.
Yeah, they do also agree that humans improve through education, right? I think the key issue here, though, is one of environment, right? That Mencius tells us about that mountain that is bare of trees, and people think that's what it's supposed to be like, because that's all they see. But they don't realize that it's bare of trees because people chopped all the trees down, right? Sun Tzu talks about the difference between setting yourself up in a civilized place and setting yourself up amongst barbarians, right? Douglas would argue, counter to his mistress's treatment of him as a brute, that she has set herself up among barbarians, right? And has thus learned bad ways. And that her original nature has thus been damaged. And I want to look at the last phrase here as well, the notion that education and slavery are incompatible with each other. How are these notions, like this idea is key to Douglas's larger argument, right? How are education and slavery, as Douglas formulates these ideas, incompatible with each other?
Goes back to shutting them up in mental darkness.
Mm-hmm.
You can't, I think she had said it, and I agree with it, that you can't control someone who knows that they're being controlled.
Yeah, if you're aware of your state, right? If you're aware of your position in the world, and if you are able to envision other possibilities for yourself, right? It becomes much harder for other people to hold you down and for you to just put up with it, right? So the fear here, the reason why these laws exist that prevent slaves from becoming literate, is that a literate slave is going to be a less pliable slave, right? A less obedient slave. And indeed, is thus more likely to revolt. Now, there is a French anthropologist. His name is Claude Meursault. And I think I have spelled his name correctly here. But his particular area of study is slavery and slaveholding cultures. And he makes a distinction between two ways we tend to talk about slaves. The first he refers to as condition. And this is when we make reference only to the way the slave is treated, right? Is the slave beaten? Is the slave deprived of food? Is the slave verbally abused, right? Is the slave treated humanely or cruelly? Now, to this he opposes the notion of the state of slavery. And the state of slavery is your legal status as a slave, right? Your legal status is a piece of property. And Meursault argues that we often tend to confuse these two things with each other, right? And we focus on the wrong kind of issue. Like, we'll ask questions about how slaves are treated without focusing on the injustice of the state itself, right? And I think that that's a big part of what Douglas is talking about here as well, right? Is, his condition is better than that of some slaves, right? So, he's told, for example, he mentions that whatever bread is in the house, he's always welcome to. But he is also made constantly aware of his state, right? That he is not equal to the members of the family. And education is a big part of what makes him aware of this gap between him and Little Master Thomas, right? The child of his master and mistress. So, I want to go here, sort of jump to the end of this, and his description of how he learns to write. So can I get somebody to start reading on page 26 from the idea as to how I might learn to write?
Sorry, maybe you've already looked at it. It's your turn.
Yeah, comes to you.
The idea as to how I might learn to write was suggested to me by being in Durgin and Bailey shipyard and frequently seeing the ship carpenters. After hewing and getting a piece of timber ready for use, write on the timber the name of that part of the ship for which it was intended. When a piece of timber was intended for the larboard side, it would be marked thus L. When a piece was for the starboard side, it would be marked thus S. A piece for the larboard side forward would be marked thus LF. When a piece was for a starboard side forward, it would be marked thus SF. For larboard aft, it would be marked thus LA. For starboard aft, it would be marked thus SA. I soon learned the names of these letters, and for what they were intended when placed upon a piece of timber in the shipyard. I immediately commenced copying them, and in a short time was able to make the four letters named.
Okay, you can stop there, at least for the moment, right? So what is he doing in order to teach himself how to write, right? So he doesn't have, as we've already noted, a teacher. How is he learning how to write?
In an environment?
Okay, yeah. This is a place where he's free to go, right? He is free to go to the shipyard and watch people at their work, right? And to try to figure out what these symbols that they're scratching on the timbers they're building ships out of mean, right?
I don't know.
So through initials.
Yeah, he's okay. Starbird starts with an S sound, right? Okay, so that must be what that symbol means, right? So he's making inferences based on what he observes.
Did he have 70 copies from his master's journals, like you wrote down, like he said?
Yeah, that's a little further down here, right? So we'll talk about that in a minute. But I want to remind you of that passage in Sun Tzu on encouraging learning, right? When he talks about the difference between thought and study. Right, how thought is like standing on your tiptoes to get a better view. And study is like climbing up to the top of a mountain to get a better view, right? What's the relationship there? How is thought like standing on your tiptoes while study is like climbing up a mountain?
So you mean bringing it back to this?
Well, let's just start with the way Sun Tzu frames it first, and then we'll bring it back to this.
I mean, I guess you can think about what you want to do all day long, but until you start working on it, actually studying what you're wanting to learn.
Well, he's talking about mental activity in both senses, or in both words, right? Why is study more productive? What are you doing when you're studying that you're not doing if you're just sitting and thinking?
You're given the tools to study with.
Yeah, exactly. You're making use of the tools available to you, right? So, he said, like why swim down the river when you can take a boat, right? Why walk 20 miles down the road and you can take a carriage, right? Well, the thing that distinguishes the gentleman from the petty man is that the gentleman knows how to make use of what's available, right? So that's exactly what Douglas is doing here. He doesn't have a teacher, but he is making use of what resources are available to him in order to teach himself to write. Now, I think it's also particularly telling and interesting, right, that, Seneca would have looked upon the trade of shipbuilding, the skills involved in shipbuilding, with relative contempt, right? This is vocational stuff. This is just, you know how to fit timbers together in order to make a ship that you can sell to somebody. Great, good for you, right?
For
Woo-hoo.
money though, right?
What's that?
Like for money?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, a trade that you can use to make money, right? So Seneca had no interest in those trades that involved physical labor or money making, right? But here, through observing people at their physical labor, right, Douglas is learning something that will help him to freedom, right? To literal freedom. Not just the freedom to sit on his ass all day thinking about stuff. So, I think that Douglas stresses the value of physical labor quite a bit more than someone like Seneca does. That in fact there is mental activity involved in it. And not only that, that there is much that a person can learn through observation of other people at their work, right? Now the other thing that he has available to him, and this is what I think what you were pointing out at the end of the paragraph here, Hannah, right? If we look at this, during this time, my copybook was the board fence, brick wall, and pavement. My pen and ink was a lump of chalk. So he's writing on whatever surfaces he can with whatever he can get his hands on to write with. With these, I learned mainly how to write. I then commenced and continued copying the italics in Webster's spelling book until I could make them all without looking on the book. By this time, my little master Thomas had gone to school and learned how to write and had written over a number of copybooks. These had been brought home and shown to some of our near neighbors and then laid aside. My mistress used to go to class meeting at the Wilk Street Meeting House every Monday afternoon and leave me to take care of the house. When left thus, I used to spend the time in writing in the spaces left in Master Thomas's copybook, copying what he had written. I continued to do this until I could write a hand very similar to that of Master Thomas. Thus, after a long, tedious effort for years, I finally succeeded in learning how to write. So, what things are made available to him here, or maybe not consciously, like what's the thing that's actually being made available to him when his mistress goes to church? Are they actually making the book available to him? Or is he just...
So that's the case, free time?
Yeah, exactly. He's making good use of time, right? He has these couple of hours every week where he's left alone in the house and unobserved, and is thus able to seize privileges that he would not ordinarily have, right? Essentially, he's able to grab this copybook. And I think, it's interesting, too, that like what's he doing in the copybook?
Tracing over the little boy's handwriting.
Yeah, he's copying the little boy's handwriting, and he's doing so by writing in the blank spaces left behind, right? So, what he is doing is making use of the openings unconsciously left by his masters, right? these leavings of theirs that they're not even really thinking about, right? But that for him represent opportunity. Right, it's a chance for him to copy out in his own hand the words on the page. It's a chance for him to have a few hours to himself in which he can conduct this work. And the expectation is that he is managing the house while they're gone, keeping an eye on things. But in fact, what he is doing is using the opportunity for his own education, his own advancement, right? And I think it's also sort of telling you that, like, the last sentence here I'd like to focus on for a second. Thus, after a long, tedious effort for years, I finally succeeded in learning how to write. Why do you think he emphasizes the length of the process here?
Because of the time allotted to it?
Yeah, I mean, he is making the best use of what little time he gets, right?
And also how he didn't just have like one set teacher.
Yep.
He had like he would be getting bits and pieces from everybody, and then at the
Uh-huh.
end he would be trying to teach himself.
Yeah, he's got to cobble it all together himself, right? From all kinds of different, whatever sources he can. And does his little master Thomas have to expend a long, tedious effort for years in order to learn to write?
Yes.
I mean, also take a longer because unlike his like masters, he didn't have a set time per day to learn.
Yep. He's, got, maybe once a week when mistress goes to church that he can do this, right?
So basically, like you're saying, like as Master Thomas was learning, Frederick was learning too.
Well, afterwards, right?
Yeah.
And at a much slower pace because he doesn't have the advantages Master Thomas has, right?
Mm-hmm.
Basically what he has is his own intelligence and resourcefulness, right? Master Thomas has teachers, Master Thomas has formal schooling, Master Thomas has a copybook.
What is a copybook?
It's just a notebook that you're writing exercises in. So because Master Thomas has access to formal education, it doesn't take him this long to learn to write, right? By the time Douglas can write, he's a teenager. And I think that, we often overlook kind of like in the days of compulsory education, like just how weird it is historically that most people can read. Like, do any of you know an adult who is cognitively normal, who is unable to read and write? Okay, like usually when I ask that question to a place, like nobody knows an adult who can't read and write, right?
I'm older now, so different generation.
Yeah, but I mean, I don't know.
Nowadays, it's
Yeah,
strange.
like I'm 42. I don't know an adult who can't read and write, right?
I mean,
I want to say they're in their 60s. 65.
Mm-hmm.
I'm saying this was like special cases or something like medically ill.
Well, yeah,
And it's like,
yeah. That was why I said cognitively normal. Yeah. It's very uncommon for an adult nowadays to not be able to read and write because we've all sort of grown up in this system of compulsory education where at the very least, most people have a basic level of literacy. In Douglas's time, this was like formal education was largely limited to people who could pay for it. And for someone like Douglas himself, who not only doesn't have the money to pay for education, but is legally barred from getting an education, right? The fact that he is able to accomplish this at all is enormous, right? I think that it's probably also a good idea to look at his reading material and what he's learning from that. So we talked a little bit about the newspapers here. We'll come back to that. But I also want to look at this book that he is, this book that he gets his hands on called the Colombian Orator. Can I get somebody to read on page 24 the paragraph that starts with, "I was now about 12 years old."
I was now about 12 years old, and the thought of being a slave for life began to bear heavily upon my heart. Just about this time, I got hold of a book entitled The Colombian Order. Every opportunity I got, I used to read this book.
It's okay.
Among much of the other interesting matter, I found it a dialogue between a master and his slave. The slave was represented as having run away from his master 3 times. The dialogue represented the conversation which took place between them when the slave was retaken the 3rd time. In this dialogue, the whole argument in behalf of slavery was, I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time with the glare.
Okay.
And I keep losing my place.
In this dialogue, the whole argument in behalf of slavery.
I lost it completely.
Fourth line up
Okay,
from
here
the
we
bottom of the
go.
paragraph.
Was brought forward by the master, all of which was disposed of by the slave. The slave was made to say some very smart as well as impressive things in reply to his master, things which had the desired though unexpected effect, for the conversation resulted in the voluntary emancipation of the slave on the part of the master.
Okay, thank you. So, the book is called The Colombian Orator. Do any of you know what Colombian means in this context? With a U rather than an O. Think District of Columbus. So Colombian with a U usually means American. Right? It's a reference to Christopher Columbus. The United States was sometimes, particularly in the 17th and 18th centuries, sometimes referred to as Columbia rather than as the United States of America, as a kind of like figurative name, right?
They have the Colombian Exchange as well.
Yeah. Yeah, we have the District of Columbus, we have as our capital. Even though Columbus never actually set foot on the North American mainland, right? He stopped in the West Indies and never went any further. And never actually understood what it was that he'd found. So, there's that. Now, orator, what's an orator? What does an orator do? Yeah, an orator is a speaker, right? So what he's got his hands on here is a textbook of American rhetoric, right? Rhetoric being, in this case, the use of language to persuade, right? And what's interesting about this master-slave dialogue that he has stumbled across? Why is this of interest to him?
Because he's enslaved.
Yeah, okay, he sees a mirror for his own situation, right? And not only that, who's the more effective orator? The slave is the more effective orator. It is the more persuasive of the two. The slave is so persuasive that he is able to convince the master to release him, right? So on the one hand, he sees in this dialogue,
But technically, like, then he could get released because he ran away.
well, that gives the slave the opportunity to make the argument as to why he should be free, right? They're having a conversation after the slave has been captured again, right? But the master decides to release the slave after the conversation, right? Because the slave's arguments are better. So yeah, he sees the potential for making arguments for emancipation. But this is a model for him in another way as well, right? In that what he sees here is someone in the same state as himself who is nonetheless intelligent, right? Intelligent enough to make a compelling argument. Right, a model of intelligence and ultimately success. This could be you, right? And then if we look at the paragraph below this, page 24, right? In the same book, I met with one of Sheridan's mighty speeches on and in behalf of Catholic emancipation. What he's talking about here is that Richard Brinsley Sheridan was an Irish writer, and in Britain, in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, there were a lot of restrictions on the rights of Catholics to worship freely and to serve in government. So Brinsley Sheridan's speeches are in favor of allowing Catholics full participation in British public life. These were choice documents to me. I read them over and over again with unabashed interest, or unabated interest. They gave tongue to interesting thoughts of my own soul, which had frequently flashed through my mind and died away for want of utterance. The moral which I gained from the dialogue was the power of truth over the conscience of even a slaveholder. What I got from Sheridan was a bold denunciation of slavery and a powerful vindication of human rights. The reading of these documents enabled me to utter my thoughts and to meet the arguments brought forward to sustain slavery. But while they relieved me of one difficulty, they brought on another even more painful than the one of which I was relieved. The more I read, the more I was led to abhor and detest my enslavers. I could regard them in no other light than a band of successful robbers who had left their home and gone to Africa and stolen us from our homes, and in a strange land reduced us to slavery. I loathed them as being the meanest as well as the most wicked of men. As I read and contemplated the subject, behold, that very discontentment which Master Hewitt predicted would follow my learning to read had already come to torment and sting my soul to unutterable anguish. So one thing that he's saying here is that in a sense, his masters were right in their own interests not to teach him, right? Because what he learns is to hate them, to be angry